Whenever you're. Sounds good?
We are recording, okay.
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
I will. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. My name is Nick Beuret. I am the author of this strategically placed book. You'll have to forgive me, I'm not used to doing author events because while I do write things for a living, I'm not typically in this sort of authorial position. But I do want to thank everyone for coming out. This book has been out for about 6 weeks now, so it's still very new, and it's a real privilege to be able to share it with you all.
Woo!
So what I might do is just a bit of an overview of the book itself and some of the core arguments, and then hand over to Kate, and we're going to talk about co-op and the failures of the transition in Scotland, apparently of which there are many. And I'm actually not doing a very good job of this, and Nick will compare
While you're having your conversation.
Yeah. So and then hopefully we're going to do it so there's plenty of time for conversation and discussion and questions and all that sort of stuff. I also have notes in case I forget where I'm at in terms of my conversation, because even though I am a lecturer for my day job, I tend to work off notes, and so I have a very bad memory. Hopefully some of you can relate. So it does seem a bit odd to write at this particular juncture a book about the green transition. Maybe not climate change so much. I think year on year it's getting more obvious that the impacts are accelerating, but to talk about climate politics and the green transition kind of seems like it's the book is like 5 years too late. I should have done it a few years ago, and then now I should be writing about fascism or AI super overlords, or who knows what horrible thing will happen next, but something like that instead. And in some ways that would be right, because the moment does seem to have passed. It's only a few years ago that we had massive climate movements. There was a huge rally, I'd say huge? A big rally, like in Glasgow today, in Edinburgh as well. On Saturday. It's Monday, I have to keep remembering it's Monday. But even if just going a few years back, you had like absolutely unprecedented crowds on the streets of Glasgow, absolutely massive movement. And a few years before that, we were dealing with Fridays for Futures, XR. A few years before that, we had a climate camp. And it's just in these two countries. I'm not in England. No. I'm north of the border, thank God. And so that would have been the right moment. And during that moment, there was a particular vision of what the transition should be. And that's sort of the politics that were inscribed in law, in climate policies, in trade union documents, in political campaigns, was this idea that there would be a transition that would, maybe in its ideal form, we'd go so far to say it looks like a Green New Deal. So basically it'd be a win-win-win. Everybody would win. There'd be a deal for business that would get a renewed sense of purpose and growth. There'd be good jobs, steady jobs, good paychecks. For the unions, they thought it'd be like well unionized or easily organized workplaces. For government, you'd get sort of a climate dividend, sort of legitimacy, new policies, and a sense of national renewal. Now, part of the problem of that period was that that's the only way we could think of the transition. It was either that, some variation of that, or it just wasn't a real transition. So we had this idea of like, the transition was going to be something like what we imagined, that a transition could only be a positive thing, or it was just a lie. And one of the reasons to write this book now is because one of the things that we fought for has come to pass. We actually do have a transition, but it's a real betrayal. It's not what we were promised, but it's also doesn't mean it's a lie though. It's still an actual transition. It's still underway. It's just not what we were promised. And part of the incentive to write the book was that there seemed to be a bit of a trap, or sort of a moment in climate circles, disintegrating as they are south of the border, but possibly still intact in the north, that we'd failed, that the transition hadn't happened, and so people kept fighting to make something happen. And not to beat a dead horse, but to use that XR phrase, to tell the truth so climates would act now, so governments would act now. That's the idea. If we just have to force the issue again and again and again, we'd get a real transition. And the sense that I had was that we were really missing the bigger picture, that we're going to end up fighting the wrong war. We're going to fight to make things happen and miss what was actually happening at our feet. If I was going to be provocative, it's not in the book, but if it was going to be provocative, it would be also the realization that Reform possibly is the first transition party, that they're actually fighting the war of transition, but not in the terms that we would want, and not for a better transition at all, in many ways to make it much, much worse. Now, the book itself sets out from the contention that there is a transition underway, and it has a particular shape and a particular contour, but it's not really about addressing climate change. Climate change is a means to an end. And this, in the book, I go back to through the history of it and the rest of it. Starting, we can go all the way back to the 90s if you really want to dig deep into the sort of ecological economics of it. But the idea was, around 2008, for those who are really old like me, would remember the financial crisis. And I'm assuming most of the people in the room are much more youthful than I am, so you probably don't remember it that well. But it was really with that crisis in 2008 that there was a realization that we could take some of these ideas that have been circulating around to use adapting our economies to climate change to restore economic growth, to really bring back jobs. And that's the essence of the transition economy. It's using climate change to create growth. And that's it. Stopping climate change would be a nice outcome. I'm not saying lots of CEOs are just purely evil, cynical lizard men. Some of them definitely are, and they're all in AI, but not all of them. Some of them are I guess we could call them useful idiots. And not for us, obviously, but for big business. I'm not saying they're not well-meaning, but that's not the main objective. The main objective is to restore growth. Now, what happened is, starting then in fits and starts, in the UK in particular, was one of the early adopters of the Climate Change Act in 2009, a new sort of framework for economic reality started to get folded out. Now, it's sort of borrowed parts, some new, some old. Lots of the parts in neoliberal would all recognize the more egregious aspects of it. But the essential idea was to use government policy to create a safe environment for big business to invest. And that big business would solve the problem for us. And what it would essentially do is invest in new industries and innovation, that magic word that no one really knows what it means. And that would create jobs and all the technologies and all the shiny things that we'd need to stop climate change. Now, there's two things to this. The first is that essentially what we're talking about is the privatization of climate change. So government's job is to de-risk investment. So it crushes protests, it undermines local democracy, it guarantees profits, it creates new markets, it enables new monopolies. It tries not to use protectionism, but it does use incentives to bribe companies to not leave the UK, which is essentially what industrial policies now results in. And on the other hand, the objective that it wanted to go for was to electrify everything, so nothing would have to change. Nothing about anybody's lifestyles would have to change in any way, shape, or form. So we get private business to build out an electric version of everything, so everything stays the same. This came with a series of promises, and probably the most important one, if we're going to keep reform in mind, it's hard not to at the moment because they're such vile people, is that the promise behind this and some of the motivation behind it was it was going to bring back industrial jobs, making things. Because after all, the transitions, lots of new machines and new infrastructure, it's building an entire new future. So the promise was industry, it would revitalize industry, and that's a really insidious promise to make to a deindustrialized country like Britain, England, Scotland, Actually, this is to the US as well. This was part of the promise. Now, this promise was betrayed. And it's interesting because this promise was also, it was, not to put too fine a point on it, it was a promise made by men to other men so they could do manly jobs. And it sounds like a not a very nice thing to say, but that's the promise. And so the green transition, one of the first betrayals was to men about the sorts of jobs they were supposed to get. And I think this helps make sense of some of the gender dynamics around green politics, and particularly the kinds of green politics that Reform espoused. So the first thing the transition did is not produce industrial jobs, it produced betrayed promises. And this is the interesting thing, it did still produce jobs, but the green sector is still growing at 10% a year. There's still, I think across the UK there's like 700,000 jobs in the net zero sector. The problem is those jobs largely are in small businesses, and it's installing things. Maybe it's some sales, maybe it's a bit of IT work here and there, but overwhelmingly it's taking things made somewhere else in somebody else's factories, largely in extended Chinese supply chains, and installing them here. And the Scottish TUC put out a report today, I can't remember the title of it.
1 in a million.
1 in a million. And one of the takeaways in it was that that's exactly what the Scottish net zero sector by and large is. It's a service sector. Now, one of the things in the service sector, we can get to the weeds on it, the service sector doesn't provide jobs in the same way as an industrial sector. It doesn't multiply out, it doesn't value add, it doesn't build the economy. Now, it's not the only thing that we could say about the economy, the sort of the industry that it produces. Normally what you would say about climate change is that one of the key takeaways from the kind of economy it's creating is a much hotter one, where people labour under heat stress, under minimal protections, under increasing strain from services that are disrupted by floods and shortages, supply chain disruptions. We're talking about a much more chaotic economy that's running hot, that's like it's undermined fundamentally by the inflationary effects of climate change. And that's true. It's not just the insulation economy, it's a much more disrupted and patchy one. But it does sort of bring you full circle back to one of the key parts of this economy, which is it's not one that stops climate change before 3 degrees, because that's not its objective. So it's a funny transition that it's actually happening, it's really creating jobs, it really is reconfiguring the economy, and it's taking us into a catastrophic future, all at the same time. Which then has another series of effects on the economy. And you can sort of sum it up in 2 ways. I'm not going to belabor the climate change point. I'm sure every single person in the room has read enough of the Doom to get through it. But not only will everything get more expensive and harder to do, it's really, as the temperature mounts, we end up with a far more disrupted life. Things break down, things become more difficult, we can do less. Just small takeaways, like every single time there's a flood and it hits and it affects a business, that business usually takes a few months to recover, if it recovers at all. Half of them don't recover. So the sort of future that we're looking at as we creep towards 3 degrees is one where things don't work, things break down, things are more expensive, if they're like functional at all, if we can even get hold of them. And of course that has the perverse effect of putting even more pressure on all those small businesses building out the green transition, creating a kind of a real suffering agency amongst the small industries, supposedly taking us somewhere safely below 3 degrees. If I was going to sum up this sort of economy that we're producing, that's it. And what it does is not just set out betrayed promises for a particular part of the working class. It produces a contraction of the future, of the series of the possibilities that we can imagine for ourselves that our future will hold, not just in terms of the things we can afford to do, the things that are open, the services we can access, but also the jobs we could conceivably take hold of. The transition economy, combined with its lack of impact on climate change, reduces the space for action, reduces political possibilities, which makes it all the harder that the second half of the book is really optimistic. It's really upbeat. It's kind of upbeat. It's semi-upbeat. I promise there are upbeat moments in the second half of the book. That one reviewer said that I should have put more breadcrumbs of hope through the book, but there's some breadcrumbs of hope. But all that's to say a relatively depressing stall in some ways. But I think it's important to be realistic at this point. To not, I end with Cabril's sort of lines of tell no lies, hide no mistakes, claim no easy victories. And I think it's at this particular juncture, like more lies, hiding more mistakes, claiming easy victories, like the transition will just mean an easy win for everybody, could only make things worse. So in terms of the title, or something worse, I think continuing to tell ourselves lies would be the worst thing. But the transitions, we're still in the early stage, we're still in the introductory period of the transition. And the interesting thing about transitions are that they're incredibly fluid periods. And things tend to become political almost immediately. Everything becomes political. Everything becomes a moment of contestation relatively easily. So I do think this is the moment to intervene into the transition. And if we move from trying to initiate one or demand that action be taken and recognize what is going on, we can find points of leverage where we can change the course of things. And I don't want to talk for too long, but I'll just sort of really quickly name the sort of three that I get into in the book. They're far from the only three. I think such an open field would mean there's a proliferation of different places we can intervene. But the three that I think are necessary is, the first is around the environment movement itself. And that one of the lessons that the environment movement learned, and this is a very broad brush stroke, and I'm including myself in this and excluding everybody else in the room who was part of a different environment movement, has gotten a bit too tame. That we actually thought there was a pedagogical function, that we could just tell the truth or convince people, put enough people in the streets, and change would happen. But one of the great track records of the environment movement has been its militancy. When it takes direct action, when it gets in blockades, when it fucks shit up, for lack of a better phrasing. I'm Australian, I really am sorry. That's when we start to get some friction. It doesn't mean it's necessarily easy victories, but there is a really powerful track record of a militant environment movement achieving real change. So I think making the environment movement dangerous again would be a really good starting point, because 3 degrees is too many. It's now 1.5 too many. We're at 1.5. Like, if we can stop it below 2, we're going to do really well. But it has to be non-negotiable. The environment movement needs to become as militant as possible, because we can't survive 3. I should clarify that. We can survive 3. The apocalypse will be disappointing. It would be horrific for billions of people, and that cannot be suffered. In terms of everyday life, one of the things that people will notice first, and this is when I teach, I ask my students who recognises climate impacts in their own lives, and almost no one puts their hand up. When I ask who's noticed that their shopping has increased in price, who's changed what they've bought, every single hand goes up. Shoplifting is a form of climate activism. Like, resisting price increases is a form of climate activism. Our wallets is where we often encounter climate change first in our everyday lives. So agitating for and imposing price controls is probably one of the most powerful everyday forms of climate activism at this particular juncture. And it's important in order to create the space for other forms of politics. And that's the third one, is that actually we need to find somewhere where we can take hold of the economy within which we're embedded, and within which we live, and start to create something different that serves our needs. So we need a positive space of imagining and creating something alternate and different. It's hard at this particular juncture to imagine immediately seizing the reins of central government. Where we can start to act, where we can work with unions, community groups, with other organisations, is at a municipal level. We can learn some of the lessons from the radical municipal period a few years ago, and find ways to not just take hold of the reins in a very immediate sort of sense, in terms of those immediate levers, but also start to work across different groups and plan out what we actually want work to do. Because part of the problem we've had so far in the transition is that when we haven't encountered conflict in the workplace, it's been a defensive struggle. We've just tried to save the jobs we've had and not imagined what we could do differently. And it's for those reasons I think that there's still the possibility of reshaping the transition to a different series of purposes. But it's that sense that we need to be immediately political. We need to make demands and be really quite upfront about what it is that we want work to do. We don't want work just to survive. Like, work is what makes everything function. So what could we do differently? Thank you.
It's just like going.
Yeah. I'm not particularly good at this, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Hi everyone. My name's Kate. I am the movement building lead at Friends of the Earth Scotland. So anyone who hasn't heard of Friends of the Earth, we are Friends of Scotland. We are an organisation that campaigns and organises around the energy transition, basically. And I actually, I did read read most of the book, but I read most of the book, and I did feel slightly atted at some points by the people that you constantly talk about as the professional optimists. But I think what I found quite interesting is within Friends of the Earth Scotland, we had a conversation maybe 3 years ago now, along the lines of the kind of thesis of this book, which is like, our movements are not winning. We're losing political ground. We're losing grounds like with the people who could be in our movement, but their like valid fears and concerns are being mobilized by now the very far right. And we're seeing the kind of way that, I guess the way that climate activism has typically gone, but also like I think lots of other types of kind of social movements being, I wouldn't blame that kind of activism, but like that, I think you talk about it as spectacle, and we also talked about it as spectacle, like the way that we can make politics spectacle and not relevant to people's lives is part of what's fueling this sense of disempowerment, disillusionment, and like radicalism in a way that is being weaponized against people who are the most marginalized in our communities, right? It's against climate action, but it's also against migrants, refugees, etc. And so we had our own kind of strategies on how to address that, and some of them overlap, some of them may be a bit different. But yeah, so I did think it was quite interesting, and I guess I kind of want to push back a little bit on the narrative of like, oh, why write a book about the transition or climate change now because we're past the moment. I think so. Myself, but also some other people in this room were part of organising a march in Glasgow on Saturday, which was part of a global day of action on as part to coincide with the COP30 that's happening currently in Belém in Brazil. And I think there's been quite a dominant narrative over the last couple of years that like, oh, people don't care about climate change anymore, and there's like, you know, polling that's come out that's like, climate isn't people's number one priority. And I think that that's had an impact on like, that's quite insidious, that narrative, and it's also changed how people organise, and people are like, well, we can't explicitly talk about the climate crisis because that isn't what people care about, but like, who in this room has one priority that you care about? Like, I think that's a really one-dimensional way of talking about. Really? What's the one thing? I think that's a really one-dimensional way of thinking about how humans interact with the world around them. And so part of the point of calling this march, and I think you also kind of slammed the point of just getting people in the streets, if the purpose, if the theory of change of that is to get people in the streets so that you get media stories so that government will act. But actually part of the point of calling this march on Saturday was, let's test that narrative, let's test if anyone gives a shit about this anymore. And actually, we had 4,000 people in the streets in Glasgow, which is the biggest climate march since COP26, which, you know, had loads of people from all over the world at. And it had a really beautiful show of exactly what I was saying, that nobody has one thing they care about, and lots of people who came could connect their thing to that. There was a block that all had Fight for Sudan placards, right? Like, they had made the connection that the genocide happening in Sudan is in part fueled by mining for minerals that fuel the green transition that we're talking about, and exacerbated by extreme weather, etc. And like, those people understand that, and they came along, and I think that flattening of people into that one-dimensional thing that they care about is actually like, that's also bad for our movements. So I was buoyed by those numbers, And I think that my learning from that was like, let's not organise apologetically about this. And we need to keep building that, and we need to do more than just being in the streets. We need to be organising in some of the ways that you talk about it. That's my first response. I got more to say.
Okay, cool. Let's do it this way. So my name is also Nick, and I teach global history and Marxism at the university just here. And I'm also an activist, member of an anti-authoritarian communist organisation called Plan C. And so when I was reading the book, which, like Kate, I read most of, but not all in all cover to cover to cover, and I loved it. I should say, like the bits that I like, everything made me think about something in a different way. And I'll come back to what Kate was saying about so-called single issues and climate change as a single issue, because I think this book is a perfect argument against climate change as a single issue. I mean, probably making that point is preaching to the choir in this audience, but it's worth emphasizing as I'll come back to. And I think that maybe I was most struck by it as a workplace organizer, and as someone thinking about how we build organizations with the collective power that trade unions have had in the past, but by and large for quite different aims than trade unions tend to be focused on right now. And I think there are really clear takeaways from this book, and there's maybe three that I wanna focus in on. One's already been mentioned. That's cost of living. Like, cost of living regularly tops these lists of what single issue do you care about the most. And there's a great concept of climate squeeze that Nick proposed for us, about how the cost of the transition directly impacts the cost of living at the same time as jobs are being suppressed and wages are being suppressed. And one of the outcomes of this is that the pickups are being made in those classic gendered ways that we all know. That more and more gendered forms of care labour are being pushed onto people who can't afford the privatised forms that have come in since the end of the welfare state. That's also a climate issue. That also means that the redistribution of collective care, the creation of collective care, immediately becomes part of struggling for the transition. I think it's already been mentioned, the ideas of Green New Deal and the Green Industrial Revolution, which some people were trying to push in the Corbyn moment, I think is the worst name that anyone's come up with for this. As if the Industrial Revolution is something that we're meant to be celebrating in and of itself. I think they speak to, but from our perspective, that issue that Nick hones in on around green investment as a new frontier of capital. That capital is and business is really eager for these opportunities. It's really eager to try and find a way to start off growth again. And we have made its jobs somewhat easier, and I'm using the royal leftist we here, although I'm sure many people in this room were arguing against it at the time. We made it easier by saying, yes, actually what is important is jobs. Not what kinds of jobs, not how much we're working, not where we're working, not how much free time it leaves us, just jobs. And I think between those two things, we can see how thinking of the end of secure employment, thinking of rising cost of living as we continue to have wage stagnation, while seeing it as an immediately relevant issue for climate, helps hold some of our other organizing concerns in tension, right? That it becomes the easiest thing in the world to say, well, actually it's quite hard to imagine a redistribution of work. So what we want is more jobs, like they had after the New Deal, or like were produced during the Industrial Revolution. Whereas recognizing it as an immediate danger in terms of avoiding 3 degrees helps keep in tension an open question for, well, actually, what should we be organizing for? Maybe what the union movement should be going back to is some of the more classic things from the 19th century. The weekend, more free time, less time organizing ourselves around work, around this sort of 24/7 culture, becomes a way of reducing the amount that we need, the levels of energy that the green transition is trying to meet, because it presumes a situation where we're using the same amount of energy, just from different sources, doing the same amount of work, just maybe in different areas. And finally, I think the third thing that I really appreciate, what I think are actually quite optimistic takeaways in this book, although Nick's nickname in our group of friends has always been Doom Nick, because he's got all the stats to make you really see the apocalypse around the corner. I think the third idea that comes along with this is moving beyond the workplace. How we link workplace struggles to community struggles and to struggles of control over our everyday lives. I think it's always struck me that take back control was such an effective slogan, and I think there's something to that. And there's something in the idea of this municipalist strategy. Of course, Murray Bookchin, one of the originators of this, was thinking ecologically long before the immediacy of the climate crisis was apparent. But where other things were apparent, like the degradation of soils, like the destruction of biodiverse areas. So if we're able to link together workplaces trying to reduce the amount they're working and what they're working on, with communities having more control over their everyday lives, and recognizing cost of living and access to basic goods as immediate necessities because of the way in which they heighten the gendered exploitation of labor, I think there's a recipe there for an excitingly different strategy that asks, as Nick does in the book, not how do we avoid Armageddon? Because although that might be a real question we're asking ourselves, it's not the question that's going to provide the answers. But how do we make a life worth living? That we can have that, our own sort of transition from seeing it as this immediate threat that's going to destroy us to a positive step forward. So yeah, I feel like I barely spoke about climate as such there, and that's a testament to the way in which this really manages to avoid that logic of single issue. It's just about how you get down, how you find new sources of energy or anything like that. It's actually how we want to organize ourselves in our movements.
So much better than it probably is. So this is a bit freewheeling. Sorry about that. But I don't want to suggest that marches are a bad thing. I have done my time organizing marches, and I still, for my sins, still organize marches. I think the book is meant as a provocation in a lot of ways, and so that, and I too worked at Friends of the Earth, but in England for many years, and I too was a professional optimist, and so I suppose the book is me calling myself out, no one else, just me. But it'd be when I was having the book commissioned, it initially was just all depressing. And the editor, like my editor at the time, Rosie, said I couldn't write just a depressing book. I had to make some proposals. And she reminded me at the time, that's the hardest thing to do, is because that's the bit that's okay. So if no one disagrees with the first half of the book, and I think it's every day another news story comes out that sort of more or less substantiate what the book's about in terms of the analysis. The hardest thing is making proposals for concrete steps of action. And I was just at an academic conference on a panel around similar things with academics who talk about similar things. And I got chewed out by the other academics specifically because I was saying, oh, maybe we should do direct action at fossil sites of fossil fuel production. And the first response is, you can't alienate the working class. I'm like, well, which part of the working class? Like, what can we do then? How can we stop climate change? And there's always in academic circles, there's no good response to that other than to imagine at some point some mythical moment of unity where there's not conflicts between unions or even within unions. And everyone who's ever organized in a union will know that it's a nightmare. You spend half your time finding your own union, and that there's no such thing as a conflict-free workplace, and there's constantly fights within the working class. But and yeah, there's many things to be said about the limitations of each of the strategies, but I think it's necessary at this particular moment, and I think Rosie's right, and I will forever be grateful that we can probably analyze the end times, like until time's end, but there is a need to start making some like sort of tentative proposals that at least we can act on, and if we get them wrong, we get them wrong. But if we don't come up with strategies at this particular juncture, at least try something different. We're not going to get anywhere. I think that's kind of why I think it's a hopeful book, in the sense that I'm no longer doom Nick. I think I'm now slightly optimistic Nick. But I think we can make strategies and can make proposals, and it does seem, at least south of the border, it has seemed like the climate movement has seen better days, and the left is in complete disarray. And so it's been interesting to watch, because I live in Suffolk, it's been interesting to watch the Greens become resurgent off the back not of a patient electoral strategy that works borough by borough, but by someone who literally goes on TV and calls reform fascists and demands taxing billionaires and is an explicit eco-populist. And I think I agree. I think sort of unapologetic politics is like, if there was ever a moment for unapologetic politics, it's now is the time to be aggressively unapologetic. If the book has a message, it's we need to be assertive. We need to assert our needs and not be scared to take a step over the line into possibly unpopular territory. Should we do discussions? Yeah. It's a consensus-driven panel. I'm not going to do jazz hands or anything like that, though. I have no more jazz hands ever. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Do we need the mic to speak loudly?
So if you can repeat the question before answering it, that would be great.
Okay, this is a memory test. Right.
Yeah.
I'll try and keep it short.
Thank you.
My name's also Nick.
That's awesome.
We're a quorum.
Now, as you said, obviously the challenge is to make proposals now. And you began by saying that a lot of the ideas around Green New Deal or whatever ultimately like solve lies and how the transition will actually play out. Right? I wonder if you have any thoughts yourself on in like a small economy like Europe or economies like those today, what could the transition look like that wouldn't be a lie? Considering, sorry, just the last one on that, the role that economies such as ours play in the whole world.
Oh, okay, mate. So, right. So I'm gonna have to paraphrase. So it's essentially, what could the economy look like? It's different. Bearing in mind, just to check, England's and possibly Scotland's imperial role in the global economy. Definitely Scotland. I did want to speak on behalf of Scotland. All right, is that a good paraphrase? So I think in the book I sort of go back to the question of like sort of community planning and counter planning. So what would community need genuinely look like? In economic terms, I mean, if we're looking for a purposeful activity that then provides for people's needs, then there's actually quite a well-established concept of the social economy. Like, it employs millions of people across Europe, that works through cooperatives and like platform structures and public services and public goods and even like new forms of the commons that provide steady employment, workplace democracy, and really do produce for people's immediate needs. And I think looking at those sorts of ideas around how to reconfigure your economy around immediate needs, but in a democratic fashion, like maybe I'm revealing my slightly 90s tendencies. I recently rebought cargo pants, and so maybe I should lean into it. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the potential for both meaningful employment, which I think people do want meaningful activity, but also that provides for people's immediate needs. But not, I don't mean it just bread, I mean roses as well. And so I think, and in some ways this is uncontroversial. This is a really well established, this is a European directive actually. There's like been lots of work on what this would look like at a European scale. So I think that would be the first step. In terms of the international question, I would hope that movements in the global south would like assert themselves for national, regional independence, autonomy, or liberation in whatever framework that wants to happen. What an internationally, what a global, reciprocal, and solidarity economy would look like, it's hard to say at this point. It would possibly mean, again, this is in terms of the honest answer in terms of uncomfortable questions, confronting the legacy of sort of the implications of extractivism and sort of exploitative relationships in our own lives. And there was a debate a few of us were having with American comrades a few years ago, where we came up with a label for American comrades as banana socialists, who assumed that Central America would want to continue to farm bananas in incredibly toxic workplaces to send to American socialists so they could eat bananas out of season. And it sounds trite, but the idea there is like, why would anyone in the global south want to continue to be exploited under such horrific conditions to provide luxury goods to people in the global north? And so I think a true international reckoning would have to involve quite a political reckoning here with what we would do without, which actually might be quite substantive. But I don't think that means an impoverished life. And I think that's the important thing to account for. I don't think monster trucks make my life better. I don't necessarily think like TikTok makes my life better. I can eat seasonally, it's totally fine. I don't think life has to be poorer for not being exploitative. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer or not. Was there another question here? Oh, and then yeah, as you, sorry, yeah, that's right.
My name's not Nick.
Oh.
It's not diversity. I'm trying to formulate a question, I just have a lot of thoughts. I work with community group development in Scotland, which is really, really interesting. I'm also a bit of a fan of Rob Hopkins, who says, you know, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So there are already communities doing stuff, and it's just to find them and to do it everywhere else. And also, we all operate at different scales, we all do different things, and we need to do everything. So we need more Marxist like on Saturday. We need more of that, we need more of everything. So yeah, and I'm looking forward to reading the book, which I've not read yet. I'm really interested in the intersection between environmental movement and class struggle. Somebody said, I can't remember who, that environmentalism without class struggle is just anarchy. So, and I'm a big volunteer in the transition movement, and lovely people, very middle class themselves, who are, they are doing more than just gardening, but still, it's very, we can afford this, we have time to do this, but it's just not connecting with the people that are really struggling with cost of living and with everything else. So how do you, and I just actually stopped talking about climate and just talking about the future. Like, we're all invested in the future. It's not about people wearing sandals and going vegan and affording organic food if you can't feed your kids, you know. So I'm interested in the class struggle thing. I'm also, so I've got another question. Actually, we've got another question. Your thoughts on UBI, so universal basic income and job guarantee? So, stop, I can keep going.
So, I'll repeat the question. Do you guys want to jump in as well? I don't want to like just hold.
Sure.
Oh, no, but
Do you want to repeat the
I'm going to repeat the question. So the two questions, right, I'm going to have to paraphrase again. One is a focus on the intersection between environmentalism and class struggle, but within a particular framework, understanding the dominance of a lot of the environment movement with people who can afford to be concerned about lifestyle choices. And then the second one was a question on the role of universal basic income and universal basic services, or just UBI?
Yeah, just UBI or UBI plus job guarantee.
And job guarantees in terms of the movement. Shall I go and then through to you?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to democratize the panel discussion. So in terms of future class struggle and environmentalism, well, I agree. I think from my background is like I have been in environment movements since the early 90s, and so I'm not super ancient, but I'm getting pretty old now. And it was, I remember one of the most explicit campaigns we ever ran at Friends of the Earth in Australia, because I've been in Friends of the Earth for a very long time, was against other environment groups who were using this concept called carrying capacity to advocate for hard borders against refugees in the 90s. I know everyone's like frowning because that's like an evil thing to do. So we took great pleasure in beating up Greenpeace and lots of other organizations for this line they were taking. And I think there is a and it's just, there is a real disconnect in lots of parts of the environment movement. But I think sometimes the connections, you're right, can be found in really odd and interesting ways. Like I know where I live, for instance, there's in Suffolk, rural Suffolk, there's lots of what's described as NIMBYs everywhere. And I was working with a local group in Lavenham, which is a little market town not too far from me, who were looking at neighbourhood planning and really trying to use planning to sort of shape the future of their town. And what struck me is that whenever we'd hold public meetings, they were really obsessed with the future, like people who were trying to block housing, and it would seem like a strange thing. But where they connected was that they actually had a vision for what their town could be that intersected with their environmental concerns for the river box that was on the town was on, for green spaces, and a particular vision against a really rapacious developmentalism. So they were opposing housing developments not because they were housing developments, but because there was no affordable housing for young families, and what they wanted was a future for their town. And for me, that became there's some in the thick of things. There are really interesting intersections between the narratives people say about the future and the questions of affordability and also environmental issues. But I think at least in my mind is that we have to be really distrustful of grand gestures around this can work with this, or we need to say green, like Joe Biden was like, when I hear climate, I think jobs. I think those sort of grand gestures don't help, because I think, like what you were saying, if we get, like in the transition towns is a good example of this in a lot of ways, is like once we get into the nitty gritty of things, then we find that the issues, like you were saying, there are no single issues. And if we're prepared to stay in the messy grey area of politics, I think we can find ways to knit those two together. I think. In terms of UBI, I think it could be interesting as an experiment. I think, and I'm not like, and I've seen some interesting examples of so I don't know, has it Autonomy Institute? They were trialing some UBI or guaranteed income schemes, but I think on in the general scheme of things, I think universal basic services are probably less amenable to market sort of market outcomes. So I think the UBI would end up just becoming, I mean, I can't remember the percentage exactly, but a huge number of people on universal credit have jobs, and so universal credit just ends up being a subsidy for Tesco's. And I think UBI would risk doing something similar. Whereas the services could then fall back into the question of the social economy of what we want to build out. And so one of the things we want to build out in a local area are a series of, I think one of my partner's favorite examples from the Second World War was these, because all the women were in factories and the men were off dying for imperialism, like they had community kitchens. And so the idea would be you wouldn't have all these isolated families trying to struggle, like all these isolated women trying to cook on their own, but you'd have community kitchens where you could, and it'd be attached to a nursery. You could drop your kid off on the way to the factory, go to the factory, come back, pick up your kid and a meal and go home. And it would sort of, that's an incredibly useful service, I think, in a lot of ways. Like imagine if everyone had a guaranteed, like 5 guaranteed meals a week or something like that. I think that would be would be start to experiment with that in an interesting way.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I guess on both points, so when you were talking about what's the strategy or whatever, when I was saying at the start, about 3 years ago, we were like, what actually needs to happen and what is the role of an organisation like ours, for instance? There's a kind of list of things that we decided to do. One of them was do strategy out loud, because I think that actually one of the key things is and particularly with NGOs, is it'll all be all of that stuff will be done internally, and then there's some kind of shiny thing where it's you just do this and I'll save everything, and that's crap, right? So one of democratizing the organization and doing strategy out loud, so we have those conversations in public. I think that's really important in terms of how we build that change. And I think just on like what role do we play in like the global economy? Like there are things that we need to prevent, of course, but also like reducing demand here is like one of the most effective ways that we can prevent those like international systems of exploitation that happen through our supply chains. And I think that's linked. Like I actually think that, you know, kind of the story that you've told in this book, which I think is true, is that the way that the transition has happened, the energy transition has happened so far, is an energy transition without class analysis, right? It's a transition of privatization. It's a transition of that prioritizes profit over everything else. Like when we talk about why that report from the STUC, they've said that for every £1 million of turnover in the offshore wind industry in Scotland, there's one job created. That's because there's a massive amount of almost all of those companies, those contracts have been given to private companies that are acting in a way that is the cheapest way possible. So they're importing wind turbines from Indonesia where conditions are terrible in the factories and etc. And we're just seeing the consequences of that privatized, profit-driven transition, and we can see the impacts of that like all over Scotland. And one of the things I said I'd talk about, which I haven't, is like some of the the failed transition stories here, or like and like there's so many to even say. But I mean, if we're taking one that is very much men promising men jobs, like the Grangemouth oil refinery, for instance, owned by Jim Ratcliffe, he was one of the richest men in the UK until he moved to Monaco, and now he's actually on TV saying we shouldn't have a wealth tax because then wealthy people will move. He lives in Monaco. So like, yeah, like he decided to shut down that refinery, losing all the jobs for those people in that area. And that's completely, there's been calls for a just transition plan for Grangemouth for a long time. The Scottish Government hasn't acted on that. Those companies make that decision and all those people lose their jobs. I think it is an instance of where a united front saying this isn't good enough has had some impact. We've actually seen recently that Unite managed to negotiate a situation where any company operating in that area that gets money from the Scottish Government through this Just Transition Fund has to prioritise those workers for jobs, which again, it's the same, it's mostly the same men getting the jobs, so it's not, talking about jobs in that holistic way, but I think like that is the story of the book, basically.
Sorry. Thank you. Those are really interesting questions. I think get to the heart of a lot of the problem here. I think basically for bridging it with class struggle, we should see class struggle in its totality, right? The class struggle has been reduced both by mainstream worker organisations and sort of in reception to just meaning workplace organising. And meaning industrial relations, official unions. It's really about dignity of life. It's about having the means to have a life that gives you a sense of self-worth. And I think that one of the things that we've got caught in since we've been on defensive for so long, since the 80s, is that we've forgotten that aspect of it. And we've fallen into a place where it's only about defending jobs. And I don't mean that to say we shouldn't care about the jobs, but we're forgetting what we want the jobs for. When you talk to people from deindustrialized areas, they're not generally nostalgic for the intense muscle strains that working in steel factories or respiratory problems that working in mines gave them. Those aren't things they're nostalgic for, right? What they're nostalgic for is the sense of a rich, vibrant community with lots of institutions with a collective life where they were, yes, it was very gendered. They were called working men's clubs. It was limited in all these different ways. But when we had the World Revolution of '68, it was because more people wanted that kind of limited life. Not it was a crisis of inclusion over having more for everyone. I mean, Keynes, no, I didn't say Marx here. Keynes said that he thought in the '60s we would have a one-day week. Obviously, that hasn't happened because capitalism isn't really about growth for making profit. It's about growth. It's about growth for control, keeping people working, and if they're working, then they're not doing other things. And so I think the version of class struggle that Nick puts front and center here is a politics of refusal that organizations can take on, and a politics of class struggle that assumes what we want is quite simply more free time to do meaningful things that we can get self-worth from outside of our workplace. And I think what that would do is have, and it's there in the book, have an impact on the global role. So much of the imperial role of maintaining the sort of imperial mode of life, the imperial role of the global north, is predicated on particular arrangements in the economy, being able to travel really far from where you work to where you're working, and then having all these faceless, go to Canary Wharf, all these identikit lunch places, Itsu, whatever it might be. I'm not speaking Itsu, it's actually all right food, but it's soulless. And the same workplace environment has all of them. And we saw, in the early days of the pandemic, with the early part of lockdown, the effect that immediately had. And I was really hopeful that what that meant was that the bottom was going to fall out of the property market in central London and we would start occupying those spaces again. Sadly not, hasn't happened. But it becomes part of a whole. We need to be working less for degrowth. And Nick was a little bit more reticent than I think he could have been in making the case for degrowth against this argument for growth, but it's there, right? It's implicit in the arguments that that's the strategy. That then immediately connects to having more time to do more things that give us a sense of life. That means having more time, for example, if you have a 2 or 3 day week, you have a lot more time for organizing, for coming up with these plans. And that has to, in order for it to connect to work struggle, that I think that has to be the way in which it happens. That if we're stuck in a place where all we're doing is affirming our role as wage laborers, then we're not going to escape this trap. I don't think it's a coincidence that Green New Deal and Green Industrial Revolution became terms as soon as there was this sort of possibility of taking power. And so you see there the way in which the desire for jobs, and subconsciously I think the desire to say, look, we're going to make sure that there's growth, come together on the project for state power. Whereas if we disrupt and refuse what's already going on, at the same time as organizing in our workplaces and communities to see how we can collectivize more and redistribute work, then I think that's actually quite an exciting vision of life for most people. It's just we don't have the movements yet and the organizations yet that can realize it. But I totally agree with what you're saying about the left always talks about building things, build, as if nothing's going on. And I really like the perspective of the Kurdish freedom movement, obviously another strong ecological, gender liberation, socialist movement, and its lead thinker Abdullah Öcalan, that democratic society, a self-organized society, is everywhere around us. Just need to make it more conscious and help ourselves to organize ourselves.
I really hope that liberation doesn't mean we just spend a lot more time organizing. I had one question.
We have time for one more burning question, but there will also be time afterwards during the signing to carry on the chat as well.
Signing as well. All right. Okay. Sorry. One more question. It's all yours.
Yes, I was going to ask, in terms of more globalized aspects of the transition, how ought we navigate the kind of the middle needs that this kind of place China has as a middle line or Russia or Sudan. How does that work in
to repeat the question is, how do we approach the question of extraction of minerals and key resources in a, particularly from the global south, in a socially just way? So I think the quick answer, because I know I'm being told it has to be quick answers. I think we could do it. There would be policy approaches we could do in terms of how would we map out using less, moving to circular economies. How do we like sort of reduce our material footprint? And I think we actually, I don't have as many books as this, but I have probably one entire shelf of plans like that, of plans on how to do that in terms of circular economics, sustainable policy, and the rest of it. I think if it was as simple as that, though, then it would have already happened. And I think policy is where politics goes to die, if I was being polite. And I think what I think would be more interesting as a challenge is, and I think we're seeing stirrings of it, is what happens when countries in the global south no longer allow the easy exploitation of their minerals. And I think if I was going to make predictions, I think there's quite a shock coming for the global north. I don't think we're going to sit at top of the pile for substantially well into the future. I think there is a reorganization at a global level, and I think there is an assertion of autonomy and national primacy in a large number of countries. I don't think it's universal. Obviously, there's like the rampant exploitation across the Sahel in terms of gold being extracted, the Congo, etc. It's all through Chile and the lithium triangle in between with Argentina as well. I think obviously it's not just magically going to turn into a situation where the global north is forced into this position of actually applying the policies that already exist. So that kind of then raises the question: if the policy is not going to do it, and we can't just hope that the South, in some senses, enacts the change for us. I think one of the things that's not in the book, but I think should be in the book, if I had a lot more space to put in the book and I ran out of words, is that actually one of the other strands would have to be a rediscovery, or not a rediscovery, but like an intensification and an embracing of an internationalist politics. I think it's actually incumbent upon us in the global north to work with movements in the global south to resist these kinds of exploitations. And I think a relatively straightforward example, if it had gone ahead, would have been the opposition to the landing of the electricity cable from occupied Western Sahara to England. There was the idea that Morocco was going to basically put solar panels and or mostly solar farms all through Western Sahara, and they was going to run a power cable from Morocco, occupied Western Sahara, to here as a form of like a renewable exploitation, or renewable colonialism, green colonialism. And it was going to land in Kent, which is a nice convenient target. There's a single landing point for the electricity cable. So I think there are ways of enacting immediate solidarity here, but I think more generally, like, actually, the UK has got quite a long tradition of supporting international struggles. And I think that's something to embrace. And like from the union movement to community movements to the environment movement, have all had like quite a long history of internationalism. And if I had an extra chapter to put in, that would have been the one to put in. Oh, there's thumbs up. Oh, I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to stick around. Apparently, I'm going to sign things, which is pretty awesome, in the other room.
Yeah.
Out there.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm also more than happy to continue the conversation, but thank you so much for coming out on a Monday night.